This is the most hyped World War II board game I've ever played. Yes, throughout all my board gaming, I've played, well, actually not that many World War II games because they're really known for being long and epic, so it's hard to do epic well. But I'm actually the most excited to talk about this epic one over all the others, over a mere prototype. This is Song for War Mediterranean Theater, where it's 1943 and the Allied forces fight the Axis over control of North Africa, Southern Europe, and that Mediterranean Sea in the middle. It's featuring a sequential movement system for air, sea, and land that makes turns feel fairly snappy for the fact that you're piloting tons of different units. Yeah, this is a sponsored video from Invicta Rex Gaming. This is not a review because we only played this big long game once. We'll be going over what we found on first impressions that are good and not so good, but we won't really be talking too much about balance or replayability because we're not really sure on that. Like, this game includes multiple scenarios, but we just played the 1943 Mediterranean scenario, which is projected to be 2 to 4 hours, and it took us 7 hours for our first game. So yeah, strap in folks, this is an epic game. It's not the most complicated actually, but it's long. You can play it 1v1 or 2v2, where we'll talk about the 1v1 we tried, but also talk about the different modes as much as we can in this review. Not review. Sorry, it's not a review. This is a first impressions, right? Just making sure if you're paying attention there. We'll still be talking about scoring, and as always, we never compromise scoring here at Shelfside, but this is sponsored, so if you want to click off, we totally get it. How to play. Goal is to get your win condition for the scenario you're playing. We're playing the Mediterranean scenario, which is to have more points than your opponent after 4 rounds, aka stages, or get an instant win, which for the Axis requires 50.5 victory points and the Allies requires 48.5 points. To get points, you'll want to get objectives, which are basically just valuable regions on the board, like these special parts of North Africa. To do that, you'll want to defeat your opponent in their areas and get a unit with a flag to take it. In this scenario, you'll play 4 stages, remember, aka rounds. Within each stage, there are 4 phases including tactical, which is movement and battle, then victory check, national support card draw, and then a huge reinforcement or spawning new troops phase. Tactical is the most complex phase, where both sides move all their units through 6 movement steps. So say the Axis first move everything at 1, this is movement 1, and if they end their movement on any enemy space, they start combat. Combat is simple. All units involved roll 1 die according to how strong they are, and stronger units roll better dice. They all roll when it's their turn, like anti-aircraft always fires at the beginning. Some units can only get damaged by certain dice, like how battleships roll black dice and can only be damaged by black dice. You can roll multiple weaker dice to become a big die. Units also have special abilities that can fire when you roll a 12 or if a certain criteria is hit, like if a submarine is attacked. Oh, and units can only attack certain areas, like how fighters can only attack other planes, and heavy bombers can attack planes or bomb the ground troops underneath them. Remember, you do movement for all 6 groups of units, and this means that some units will move twice in 1 round, like tanks move twice, once in movement 4 and once in 5. There's also a lot of unit nuance, like how artillery and battleships can fire with range. But yeah, we'll get to all that during the vid. Just all you need to know now is that players alternate doing their movement of different units. First is air, then sea, and then lastly, land. After all the movement is done, both players will draw 2 national support cards, of which they can buy 1 of. Cost is on the bottom right corner, and you get 2 of these NS money tokens around. The end of the round is spawning more troops, where you take the best stats from your held objectives and spawn troops off of this sheet as you pay their cost. Troops can go anywhere on your objectives, or if you're spawning navy, they go next to your objective. Whoever hits their VP goal first wins, or you see it at the end of the final round here. Cool stuff. So now for the cool we found in our first game. Wooden pieces are good, feel great to touch, move around, etc, etc. And they came in these boxes, though no idea if that's going to be the case for the real game. The board is also a lot more good looking than I thought it'd ever be, with objectives and airfields just popping out, and the Mediterranean water even has these cool embellishments in the background. The player aids are also really good to show all the unit specialties, the movement steps, which are basically how a round works, then the battle steps, then how dice can be used. Then lastly, definitions and how scenario setups are on the back. Essentially, you have this mostly face up the entire game, and after the first game, you don't need to reference the rulebook, things are just on here. So now it's on to the cool gameplay we found in our first game, and first is that the sequence of play works really well. As you can see on this sheet here, first is mostly fighters and subs, then it's some ships and then all fighters, then it's all ships, then it's mechanized ground things, and then the last of the ground things. Then all planes will return back to wherever they need to go. Not only does this feel very intuitive, because first you send in the air, then the ships move faster than the ground, then lastly ground is the one actually fighting for the land. But breaking the round up in this way lets both players counterplay and mind game each other well, making each part of the round tense. For example, fighters moving really fast at the beginning and then moving again lets them move effectively 8 spaces before any ship moves. Or how you can move submarines also really fast into certain positions to disincentivize Navy attacks because the submarines have ambush, but more on abilities later. There's also just an insane amount of pieces to move, so moving it all at once would be ridiculously analysis paralysis inducing. So this nice organization of movement really reduces that, and as such, there's fairly little downtime for this game's weight. Because of how confrontational this World War II kill game is, well, if your opponent does something, as in some type of movement, it's always going to affect your next movement. Or of course, it could trigger combat where you will have to roll dice. Oh, speaking of dice, that gets us to the units, of which can roll certain dice. And that's just the beginning of how unique each unit feels with their cool thematic strengths and weaknesses. Every unit has a type of armor, the type of dice it rolls, movement on the map, and an ability. Yep, every single unit has at least one ability that can trigger during combat or lets you place something down, like how destroyers can lay mines on water. So we already talked about the speedy fighters, so then there's their counterpart of heavy bombers, which suck against air, but let you roll 5 gray dice against land units. And gray dice are the one that can kill tanks. Then there's the in-between of a light bomber, which is the only air unit to attack submarines with its sonar ability. So submarines are the cheeky naval unit that seems kind of weak until you realize they can't be fought without sonar, which only light bombers and destroyers have. What's more is that they got the ambush we talked about. If they don't move, but happen to participate in combat, they upgrade their dice. Okay, so you're seeing gray dice. So that's the upgrade to white. And now let's introduce black, the best die. This is reserved for the best units like the battleship that rolls black and gray dice. It can only die to a black die. Haha, die to die. The aircraft carrier is how you get 3 anti-aircraft rolls if your navy sees some bombers, and how you hold aircraft on the aircraft carriers. And if the aircraft carrier holds the aircraft, it actually increases their defense to black, which is super thematic. For ground, you have the tanks that move 3 spaces and can move 3 spaces again in the next movement phase. So yeah, you can totally just blitz someone on land if they're not prepared for it. Infantry kind of seem like they're cheap cannon fodder, but can go into mountains, unlike tanks, and that will buff their infantry die to gray. Also, they have engineer, meaning they can put down these one-time use mines that will blow up, and these permanent defensive lines that can protect yourself from one angle of attack. Artillery is a unit with range that can attack 1 space away, but can't attack if they're moved. Bonus points if you put them into a mountain to get 2 range. Oh yeah, speaking of units having range, that's not only a mechanic that makes units feel more special, but also it rewards good positioning. So the artillery, battleship, and cruiser units all have at least 1 range, meaning they can participate in a combat even if they're not actually there. It's super thematic to have ground combat happen while being shelled by nearby fleets. Also gives another reason to have control of the seas, because if you don't, you're gonna get shelled hard on land. So now you know how cool all the units in this game are, we can talk about using them for movement, and the movement possibilities in this game are just straight immense. So as you've seen with the submarines, they have 2 movement phases in a round, which can seem like a lot, but fighters actually have 3. So they move twice at the beginning of a round, then at the end where there's the all air units return phase, meaning they can move again to return home. But you can move to any home, so you can use this to completely reposition them. Same goes for heavy bombers and air transports. Both are 7 movement, so you can move them up to 14 spaces a turn. And remember, this is tons of movement to fly out your bombers to bomb people, and air transport units to launch surprise attacks from the sky. Oh, movement gets even crazier though, because these STs, that is sea transports, have way more movement than I ever thought would be possible in the game like this. So they move in phase 2 and phase 3, and their movement allows them to pick up and drop off units. So that's like +2 movement onto each of these phases. So if you have troops near a sea transport, you can pick them up, then have them dumped off. That's extra movement. Then they can get picked up again from another ST in the next phase and moved again. And then if they're tanks, they can move 6 spaces again, 3 in each of their movement steps. Holy cow. So if you add this all up, it's 15 spaces in total moved for these tanks in 1 round. This puts a huge emphasis on sea transports for each side, which allows for great high-risk, high-reward play. You probably have to commit to load the infantry on, but if the ship dies, these guys all die in the ship. But if the ship is able to drop off, bam, tons of movement potential achieved for our boots on the ground. So why is movement potential so good? Well, it allows you to be constantly doing plays, especially with this map being so big for even more possibilities. Is this the most thematic? Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, there's like gas restrictions in real life, but this makes for engaging gameplay when you see that, oh, actually, my opponent could be attacking me from anywhere. Which coast is he going to be attacking? Which of my objectives is actually being threatened? To sum up the unit abilities and the movement potential is that this game really rewards great positioning. As said before, transports can let you chain cool movements, and you can do mind games as you set immovable mines or build defensive lines in certain directions. And with the movement potential, the board isn't necessarily as big as it seems, and action can keep happening. And another cool thing is how units interact with each other, and we can see this as when you activate a unit to fight, all units in that space will do combat. Yes, even on someone else's activation. What does this mean exactly? Well, look at this space here. You begin a fight with infantry. But look, there happens to be a heavy bomber still on your side here. So they get to do their attack because they're still on that space, and you have nearby artillery or ranged navy that can also roll. Hence, movement and combat outcomes previously done in the round will continue to matter. Like if things don't die, they're still fighting. Units can fight up to 6 times in one round, once per movement phase. It's just that the combat has to be gunned by a unit that can fight during that phase. So you can plan for these cool coordinated attacks. And because positioning is so nuanced, the reinforcement step at the end of a round is bonkers. As long as you can afford the units, you can build them in any of your faction's bases. So yeah, sky's the limit in what you can build. Do you want to get a big old battleship to bombard your opponents? Or do you want to be more sneaky with submarines and destroyers? Or maybe you could build some sea transports to actually mount that amphibious assault to actually get points? Because that's how you win. And look, this decision making is all just for water. You can do air as well. Do you want anti-air with fighters? Or you want to do war crimes and just make more heavy bombers? Or maybe threaten a paratrooper landing with air transports? Ground is building anti-air or artillery that is good, but it doesn't really move. Or you can get tanks to get a big offensive, or land transports to move your infantry. Should everything go on the front lines to launch a big old assault soon? Or should they shore up your defenses in case you get surprise attacked? There's 4 different air units, 6 different sea units, and 5 different land units. Pretty much all of them are worth buying and combining together with their semi-rock, paper, scissors, like how submarines counter big ships yet die to destroyers, which in turn get killed by big ships. Well, so some more cool stuff is that how the combat resolution is handled. See, it's broken down into these 7 steps, which not only feels thematic, but also it breaks down the dice rolls, which makes you feel more oomph and flavor with each hit. And you only roll once. That is, you only roll 1 die per unit. So that means that if you don't kill the units there, they're still there. They're gonna survive. So if you want to really win now, you have to commit a ton of things to a fight. It favors big, bold moves before your opponent can rush to the support. It also makes transporting units via air or sea kind of risky, which it should be, because loaded guys don't get unloaded until late in a combat round. So that's put tension on both players to kill transports or pray they survive. There's a dynamic Ameritrash additions of 12 being lucky shots for some units, like destroyers, infantry, and tanks, which will upgrade their shot, which is a very satisfying value. Or how anti-aircraft can roll a 12 to shoot exactly what they want and take down an air transport or heavy bomber. So yeah, sometimes it's good to bring extra troops, huh? Lastly, for combat, the way they handled different troop health was good, where white dice cannot puncture gray armor, and gray dice cannot puncture black armor, unless you hold your fire until the end of a round to do a concentrated fire, which is a great trade-off in having a slower hit, so you might die before you get the shot off. But if you do survive, you can get an amazing concentrated shot. It rewards clumping small units to actually let them do something against, say, a battleship, but again, they have to roll a hit. So this is a lucky thing, but it can happen, which all makes sense. Combat just has a lot of hype moments of getting lucky shots to kill transports, getting great bombard rolls, or just rolling different dice for, say, a battleship just shelling someone from afar. Every combat is really like, survive the anti-aircraft roll, now fighters go, now bombers go, now ships fight, now the slow ships fight, and artillery. Then let's duke it out on land if anything else survived. It just fits a water-centric map like the Mediterranean well. Song for War also has some cool progression through these NS cards, where each faction, Italian, Germans, American, British, all have their unique decks, and you'll be drawing cards to buy them, which does add some cool, possibly unit upgrades. Like there's the U-boat buff, or the German fighter buff, so units can roll twice in one combat round. Sheesh, these crazy German engineers at it again. Or this Tiger tank to upgrade the German tank armor to black, but makes it slower to move. I know, hard to see on this prototype, but this is black armor. I was the American, so I got the B-17 Flying Fortress buff to make the heavy bombers quite well rounded. And it was like Masters of the Air, as my bombers had more health and could start their bombing run from further away. Then these Brits can move fighters and yet another phase in a round, which was awesome for movement. +4 movement, basically. Oh yeah, and because this is World War II, there is the inherent asymmetry. Like the red Germans aren't really that strong in this theater because they're not really that invested in the Mediterranean. This is really south of where Germany is. Like they hang out in North Africa, definitely a little bit. They have some troops around, but it's really up to Italians to pull their weight there. You know, Mare Nostrum and all that. Yeah. Return of Rome. I mean, Italians are just kind of a joke in World War II, but in this game, they actually do stuff. Then Americans and British aren't exactly in the best position to pressure Southern Europe, but they do have the best resource production in the game. Okay, last cool mechanic before we wrap up the cool section, which is the hidden fleet mechanic, which we didn't explain at all, so let's go. Both sides will start with a hidden fleet in the Mediterranean, which has its units public. It's just that the opponent doesn't know truly where this fleet is. At first, I thought this was just kind of tacky, but actually hidden ships in the water is incredibly tense, especially if they have sea transports with troops inside to pressure landings. This is really thematic because hidden fleets, it's hard to see in the water, and it adds a strong layer of mind games. What's more is that you can even recreate the hidden fleet if it gets found, so you can be constantly ambushing, then re-hiding it to mess with your enemies. To wrap this up, yeah, it's just insanely thematic World War II gameplay in Song for War. Units all feel appropriately used and have the proper strength, and if you look at combat, you soften them up, right? Soften them up with air, then do some bombing, shelling with artillery or battleships, and then you just send in the troops. Amphibious assaults and air landings are actually hard to do if your opponent is properly defending, but you can go around your opponent's defenses too in this game. With the combined assault attacks, you can definitely imagine how there'd be British troops on the ground attacking North Africa, then their American allies have fighters and bombers from above to support them. Or you can do what Alex did to me, which is blockading me in parts of Africa and just constantly shelling me. Or I blitz in the final round with the British as I move the legion of tanks across much of North Africa. And they can actually push through defenses if they survive the fire. So I got to Tripoli and won the game through that. Okay, fine. Alex is telling me that I technically conceded the game before doing this winning play because I gave up, and then he told me I could do this after the game technically finished. Anyways, let's get to concerns. Now it's time for concerns, and we're not talking about anything too in-depth like all the balance because we don't really know everything. We only played this game once. But to start off, this game just smells bad. It smells really bad, but you guys can't tell that. And again, this is just prototype things. Probably, hopefully. For components, having the unit pieces be double-sided is such an awful idea because if anything gets flipped over for any reason, it's suddenly something else. Really matters when it's AA guns turning into infantry or worse, fighters becoming light bombers. This is compounded by how there's just not enough space on the board to hold big armies, so you have to constantly stack things. See in particular ground troops in high point places like Tunis, Malta, the list just goes on and on. So the board is already so big, it's probably not gonna get bigger. So to fix this, just have pieces have a backside that says already moved. So then if you flip it over, it's not gonna suddenly change firepower massively. Oh, and I know we only played this game once at the second biggest and longest scenario, but does this game really need this many pieces? Like this many? Per faction? Seems like kind of overkill. Some pieces also look quite similar from afar, especially the cruiser and battleship and the smaller planes. And I mean, I guess they look similar in real life. I'm no historian, but even then, it doesn't help gameplay by looking similar. At least put a dotted outline around something, huh? Oh, and why are there no combat values on pieces? Just take out this flag attribute because it's easier to remember and just show their armor and what they hit on. We have no idea why the objective markers are differently shaped. The good old Benghazi I only know about through American politics, emails and all that. Benghazi is strangely tiny and almost unreadable. This token is smaller than airfield tokens that have half as many points. What is going on here? This should also be double-sided to indicate the Axis or Allied control. And lastly, the card quality feels really bad. Like as in, I just printed these out at home. It's really hard to draw them and move them around, but prototype, right? Now onto the rulebook, which I haven't personally read, but Alexander will not shut up about how bad it was. So here's what I got after hearing to him critique. There's extremely inconsistent formatting where things intermingle with no consistent style, with the font being hard to read. Then the background image makes reading the black text hard. It's hard to find specific info easily with formatting, with so much of the rules devoted to special circumstances or clarification, which maybe should have been a different edge case section. And the charts and graphics look nice, but this info is strangely placed in them. The rulebook will do this very frustrating thing where the text will reference rules, but then it won't have a page number. Like, why are you doing this to us? So now for some gameplay concerns, and the first one is that the reinforcement phase, that is the one where you just take a bunch of troops and start plopping them on the board as you buy them. This phase has a lot of decision making, as we said before, but it's pretty darn clunky. First, the way that you calculate it is that you take the best value from each of your objectives, so you first need to hunt for that on your board, then remember it, because you're going to be spawning tons of troops. Like it's easily 20 things going down. While you're calculating all of these and determining where they should go, you can forget what your actual number is, especially when you bring up shipping lane blockades we'll get into in a bit. The scope of what you can buy is straight up insane, which is great for decision making, but maybe there should have been some more component help to facilitate this, or maybe some barriers on how many things you can produce. What came to mind is Star Wars Rebellion, where you have a place where new troops go, and that helps keep things tidy. But the weirdest thing about this reinforcement phase is the shipping lane blockading mechanic, where you can penalize your opponent's production if you have some ships in their shipping lanes. And it penalizes the production by low single digits, so it's not that big of a deal. Let me explain this mechanic. So you check the number of shipping lane spaces for a route controlled by either Axis or allies. Then whoever has more ships there penalizes their opponent's production for one objective connecting to that route. What ends up happening in game is that if you're losing on shipping lanes, you'll lose about 1 to 3 production, and often in our game, it was just one production loss. One production isn't a slouch, especially for the Germans who have the lowest starting numbers. Like having one more infantry does make the difference between surviving being bombed or not. But this mechanic is just so much overhead for not the biggest payoff. Oh, also the shipping lanes on the Mediterranean map are usually hard to see. Allied is green, so it's easier. Axis is slightly darker blue, and you just can't really tell what it is unless you squint. It's confusing. I don't really know what's a good fix for this because this mechanic is thematic, just very clunky in a board game. And the fact that it interferes with production value makes the unit spawning with so many different types even more confusing. Honestly, sometimes I felt like I should have just been playing with pen and paper to ensure I wasn't cheating. But maybe holding shipping lanes could affect objective VP to give more motivation to control the seas. Not sure, this would make sea priority way different than it is now. The next gameplay concern was some of these NS cards. Yes, they're cool progression and Ameritrash fun, but some of them just straight up airdrop troops next to your opponent's bases. What? It just feels so out of place in this game that rewards positioning. Every single faction can draw these cards, and out of nowhere, boom, decent army next to your opponent's base, and you just overrode two central mechanics of the game, building and moving. It feels very odd that a game with complete open information can have these, and since you hold NS cards in your hand between rounds, this is the only hidden info that is point altering. These do make the board state really dynamic though, especially if the player that played it was losing the game, so our solution would be to have these as public information that both teams can see coming, and or just make them insanely expensive so you can see if your opponent is saving up NS to buy one of these. So now it's time for a impression score because I only played this once and Alex played it with me and half of another smaller scenario, so we don't really have that much in-depth detail here. We can't call this a definitive score, this is not really a review, just the first impressions off one play of a very long game. But so far what we came up with is that it's good. 7 out of 10. Yeah, 7 out of 10. There's currently just a lot of clunkiness and jank in the rules and components, which further hides the inaccessibility of this being a long game. Like Song for War is a game you just really hunker down for. Remember, our game was 7 hours for 4 rounds of gameplay on our first game 1v1. And we reckon this could be drastically reduced to about 4 to 5 hours once you're comfortable, because the game does have a steep learning curve just because each unit has a very specific use. And if you're not using them correctly, you will get punished in the combats where all units are fighting. While turns can be snappy because there's actually very few rules regarding movement, the options of movement and building can spell doom if you're playing with the analysis paralysis brains. Like we were building simultaneously for most of the game to keep the game snappy. But if you're serious about outcomes, you're gonna want to wait to see what your opponent builds so then you can counter them afterwards. Oh yes, and in case it wasn't obvious by now, this game has a huge reliance on output randomness of dice rolling. Rather, it doesn't look so much like this. Doesn't really look like that, rather more like roll this one, then roll this one, then roll this one, because it's broken up. But the RNG never felt that crazy because you're just rolling an insane amount of dice throughout the game with many combats happening every single round. And you're never mindlessly chucking dice over and over again during one combat because each unit only rolls once during each combat. Over the course of many hours, yes, you're gonna have lucky shots here and there, and so will your opponent, and doing well in dice rolling usually will not make up for just positioning really well on the board. So how should you approach this game if you're interested? Well, there's actually other scenarios that are shorter that are the Italy and North Africa scenario. And you can play all scenarios 2v2. And 2v2 is probably the best way to approach this game just to take off the processing weight. And then the wacky NS cards encourage just more casual mindset. We were already making tons of mistakes in 1v1, so if you can just enjoy the military miscommunication that comes in 2v2, then you can just immerse yourself in World War II with each faction. Maybe do some roleplay. There's supply mechanics in the North Africa scenario that allegedly makes the game feel more like a gradual tug of war versus the spontaneous huge battles like we had in the Mediterranean. And then we have to compare this to other World War II games. First one that comes to mind is the Axis and Allies. We played 1941 many times, but we actually never finished a game. I'm pretty sure we never finished a game of this. The game doesn't have a set amount of rounds, and this dice chucking was just so exhausting. You just keep rolling over and over again. I believe it was because you attacked until everything died or someone retreated. While something like that was ultimately much easier to start than Song of War, ultimately it just fell apart because the mechanics were just so bare bones. Whereas when we played Song of War, the game just felt like it kept humming with that set endpoint of 4 rounds for that scenario we played. Or compared to Quartermaster General World War II. That one is just really streamlined compared to Song for War. And as such, they're hard to compare because Quartermaster General is all about cards, though if you want to finish a 3v3 World War II game in 2 hours, Quartermaster General, still your best bet. There was also Atlantic Chase, which is on the other side of Europe. That is all about the chase and less about grand assaults. They also didn't have any ground troops. And while Atlantic Chase had a really cool movement system, it handled RNG much worse than Song for War with weather rolls, and it also didn't have the same capacity to spawn more units. Song for War is definitely more of a traditional dudes on a map area control by comparison. Then lastly, the most popular World War II game, Undaunted Normandy, which actually barely feels like a World War II game to us when one comes to mind, because we're thinking grand scale armies fighting each other. But yes, this game does count and is fantastic. However, it's extremely watered down compared to Song for War, and doesn't have air or naval combat, and it doesn't have the tricky reinforcement decision space like Song for War has. Undaunted Normandy is ultimately more of a card game compared to something like Song for War, and I'd like to push it more in the direction of a kitchen dueler. But yes, if you, fellow World War II fan, yes, if you have the time and are thrilled by the movement and combat mechanics in Song for War, keep this game on your radar. It's a theme that's inherently just going to be long to play out due to the epic scale of fighting so many battles across the Mediterranean. So get your history buffs together and do your coordinated attacks of air, land, and sea, and shell your opponents accordingly. We're just hoping they fix the NS cards and some of the component jank. So yeah, here's to hoping to that.
I would give Song for War an 8 out of 10. I have a lot of fun playing the game, and it is my current favorite World War II board game. The components are very visually striking. The maps are also quite pretty too. Everything just sort of pops. Song for War really captures the feeling of a combined arms game, and I think the interplay between these three military types gives the game a deep strategic layer. It does make the game hard to learn, and the rulebook is got some problems, but once you've mastered the mechanics, once everything clicks, then it's very intuitive to go from one of the three fields to another. And I think that's largely because the movement system and the battle system are very simple. The game becomes very intuitive and very rewarding when you're able to pull off a big combined arms assault. Every unit that you have feels very purposeful. The dice-based combat system, while it does involve a lot of dice rolling, it never felt unfair. You roll so many times in the game. It felt a lot like Warhammer, where there's so many dice rolling happening in this game that it all sort of evens out, all sort of levels out. So I never felt like I was being cheated or the game was unfair, but it still has enough dice rolling that when it matters, you still feel that high of when you get really lucky and your heavy bomber just obliterates everything. Or conversely, your heavy bomber flies in and it does nothing, as what happened to Ashton a couple times. The other World War II game I played was Undaunted. I've played all the Undaunted games except the sci-fi one. I just don't like them. They're too dry, too bland. I almost like the North Africa one. If you're like me and you like area control games and you like dudes on a map and you like painting maps and grand strategy games like Paradox games like me, then I think this game will definitely appeal to you. So the game feels very much designed with accessibility in mind, and what I mean by that is this is basically Babby's first war game. This is to appeal to people who have never played war games before, but like the World War II idea, and I think Song for War is hitting that market basically dead on.
My personal score for Song for War is going to be a 7 out of 10. I actually have a good time with it. And seeing how much longer this game was than I thought it'd be, like after one round, it was already 2.5 hours, and I was still so confused about the game. I'm surprised my score isn't a 5 or 6 out of 10, but yeah, that's just how much I enjoyed the mid to late game of Song for War. So right when you start, the game is hitting you on the head with so much movement potential, and it's like, oh, I don't know what to move, like, I don't know, what should I be attacking? I don't know how strong things are. Every single combat seems to have some new rule introduced because units have so much nuance to them. Oh wow, 12s can convert to something else. Battleships can bombard. Oh, defensive lines are permanent. Needless to say, I was extremely confused until mid-game, meaning that I made some very dumb building decisions early on, like why are there 7 AA guns here? And I felt like Alexander always had some hidden bag of tricks that he'd always make up a rule that benefited him. Those darn Germans, right?
Fighter gets a 12, the target means the attacker picks one. Wow, what amazing.
Wow, what an amazing play. But yeah, the combat really grew on me. It's just so exciting to have all these different phases of combat and have it only reliant on a single die roll per unit. I wanted to equate how impactful combat seems by relating this to gambling, but actually it feels more like I'm a crack addict when I'm playing Song for War, as I have my units that I love and it's like, oh yes, wrong roll. Oh, yes, the battleship rolled a hit. It's a black hit. Oh, we're so in there. Just so much damage. That kills 2 gray things. Okay, or, oh, my first heavy bomber missed. Okay, my second heavy bomber. Let's get 1 hit at least in all these 5. Oh, I missed everything. Oh my God. Okay, now I missed everything. It's so over. Oh my God, I just wasted. So how did they all miss? The highs are so high in Song for War just because of how much destruction you can wreak off of great artillery hits. And conversely, when it happens to you, it just feels terrible. And that's how confrontational this game is. In fact, when it's not my turn, or especially going second in a round, it feels like I'm just slinking into the pits of despair. I'm gonna get attacked from some angle I haven't calculated yet. Oh, those German U-boats are sinking my ships. I guess this is how the Allies felt. Oh yeah, units just feel really good to use in this game, by the way. Really feels like I'm in Masters of the Air with the B-12 Flying Fortress, or Band of Brothers landing paratroopers, or deciding how I want to do my Navy exactly, because shelling is really fun. Currently, the only things I don't like are the length and how freaking bloated the setup and unit reinforcement is. Other than that, yeah, this game is intense, super thematic, and does dice rolling well for me. I actively want to play the North Africa scenario now. This is the World War II game I'm gonna play if someone just really likes World War II and we have the time. We'll just get the drinks, snacks ready, set aside many hours, whip out the historical facts while playing, and go to town.
3 gray hits. Yes, that's total.
I can't believe it.
Total brick destruction.
1v1 right now is at least a 7 out of 10 for me. If it was shorter, like maybe 3 hours, it could be an 8 out of 10.
Black hit. They're all dead.
Welcome to the game. Oh my God, it's like crack.
But it's not over yet. I have another guy to land.
I shoot you when you land.
It's now your one chance. You gotta kill him now.
This is it.
Or else.
This is a 7? Easy.
Oh no!
Okay, well that's okay. That's fine.